the Between Two Lines podcast, talking about performance, life, and everything in between. Featuring your hosts, Johnny Stahl and Ash Hamilton.
Welcome back to the Between Two Lines podcast, where we talk about performance, life, and everything in between. We're super grateful to bring to you today episode number 5 of the pod, which is all about knees and elbows. Ash and I discuss the similarities and differences between knee and elbow joints, differing injury and pain presentations, how you can use gait as an awesome assessment tool to improve your knee pain, and also some practical takeaways to help you and your clients who are suffering from knee or elbow pain. There's some really great insights in this episode, and I'm sure you'll absolutely love it. So let's waste no more time and tuck into it right away.
So how you going, mate?
I'm good, man. I'm good. I think I got a bit of sunburn coming in. So I was just I'm gonna have to head off to the shops and get some of that. What is it?
Aloe vera.
Yeah. So I'm gonna be stocking up on that, I think.
So I say things are very different here. Just talking about how it's snowing here and how it's sunny over there and it's starting to really heat up. It just could not be any different.
Yeah, literally the opposites. Hey, do they have like heaps of sports that come into I guess fruition come winter, like where you are? Is there like a good go-to sport that everyone's
If you go down south into like Bavaria, into Austria, they have like a massive ski season, more like alpine skiing and distance skiing. I don't know that much about it, to be honest, but it always snows up there in the mountains, obviously with the altitude and everything, and so they have a pretty intense like ski season and everything. How it will be with Corona and everything, I'm not too sure, because things are getting pretty full on again here with Corona, but for the most part, and just it's really funny, like all the soccer pitches here, most of the pitches, it's like I play reasonable league soccer here, but most of the pitches you play on are fake grass because of the weather. So the weather, because the pitches just get fucked when it's a bit snowy and frosty and wet and everything. The grass just turns to absolute mush. So it's just like it's a totally different experience. It's awesome.
Yeah, seriously, legit. Do you board or ski?
No, I've skied once in Bulgaria last year.
Oh, you're kidding.
Yeah,
mate.
I know. Maybe Jan or Feb next year. It's in the coming months. That'd be awesome, man. That would be the plan. Get away somewhere for a week or so and ski. I had the time of my life, man. I just never got into it, and then I did it last year and caught up with my brother in a place called Bansko in Bulgaria. And I had the best time ever. It was fucking awesome. 5 days of skiing.
Oh man, I love it, and that's one thing that I'm spewing because of COVID and stuff. I haven't been for about 4 years, but before that, I used to go with the boys to Queenstown in New Zealand. Yeah, and that is a holiday. It has everything. You got the adrenaline, you got the nightlife, you got the scenery. You got the fellas, you got the slopes, and it's just thinking about it just makes me up and about, just the thought. But I was actually going to ask you, but since you haven't really been into it, I can't think of a single injury that I know anyone apart from broken bones that snow sports brings. Knees and broken bones. It seems like there's no in between. It's I've
heard of a lot of ACLs.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's 0 to 100.
Oh, right. Okay. So there's not like little scratches or little muscular injuries or anything. It's more just you either completely batter yourself or you just get away scot-free kind of thing.
Yeah, because when you just mentioned, I'm gee, I wonder whether will I get into snow sports is my nation. I can go to Canada or something, and that'd be awesome. But I was just thinking about it, I'm apart from knees and broken bones, I was I don't know any of my mates that have had an injury apart from those. So
it's a really interesting topic. Actually, one of the guys I used to work with back in Melbourne, he did a lot working with the Winter Olympic team. And the sports doc there is actually the chief medical officer for the Winter Olympic team. So it'd be awesome to get one or both of them onto the pod and just dive into that. Let's actually do that. That'd be really awesome.
I'm curious.
Yeah. And because that's particularly more the elite level. So I wonder how they go with all of that, because their training load would be massive and everything. What actually happens to them at that level, and what how they sort of intervene and everything.
Well, it'd be interesting because with snowboarding, I can't speak for ice skating. Not ice skating. What is it? Skiing. Poof, completely different thing. And it's like, it's managing center of mass, whether you're toe side or heel side and all that type of thing. So it'd be very interesting to kind of hear whether they kind of factor that into the rehab. Because like, I don't know if you saw my story the other day. I met up with this mate of mine. I used to do some rehab with him, and he had an electric skateboard.
Yeah.
And man, like, I'm no good on a skateboard, I can tell you that much, but it was cool. I was like, I'm getting one. That's going on the Christmas list. Like, but it was funny because it's like center of mass, man. I had all my weight in the back foot. As soon as I pressed the trigger for the electric thing, I was like,
you just flew back.
Bang. Oh, I reckon I caught myself 4 times. I'm like, I nearly died 4 times, or like, smacked my head. So yeah, like I reckon that'd be like a super interesting thing to kind of explore, because that manipulation of center of mass being strapped into something, it'd be kind of interesting to kind of see what variables they kind of put at the forefront of programming.
For sure. I think it's something that a lot of people can take away from, take a lot away from as well. Just as a discussion topic, I think it'd be awesome to dive into it. I think, either winter season in Australia, and the winter season's obviously pretty big here in Germany and in Europe. Just how people would be able to translate that into their own experiences, I think could be really valuable for a lot of people as well.
Yeah, for sure. And like, I guess, speaking about knees as being like one of the biggest injuries, what do you reckon, like one of the common injuries you're seeing at the moment? Like, are you seeing a lot of lower? Are you seeing a lot of upper?
I've been seeing quite a lot of, just generally, I think. So I've been dealing with a couple of shoulders, like quite different presentations, but also knees for sure. And I think something that's particularly common is sort of tendon related, that sort of less specific tendon related sort of knee pain around that knee joint, sort of goes from the front of the knee to the inside or the outside. And, when people get that presentation where they ask them how they feel or where they feel it, and they just say, it's sort of around that knee. So I've been getting a bit of that and just been breaking that down. Something we wanted to discuss today specifically along with elbows, and I think it's a really good way to dive in now, is just to discuss that non-specific knee pain just generally, but also some more specific stuff, the assessments, how we might look at that. And I think it's just really important. Go on.
I was going to say, would you chuck the non-specific knee pain? Like, are you finding it's like, like a patella femoral type pain, or are you noticing more like the tendon? What kind of like presentations are you kind of like noticing with those?
Yeah, so a lot of that sort of tendon pain, and something I get a little bit of as well, like just because I play football soccer on a pretty hard pitch. On a pretty hard pitch, and I sometimes just get some sort of referral pain. So, suboptimal movement and mechanics from that right foot, and also I'd say from my right hip. And the thing with the knee is that the knee's a pretty simple joint in theory that's placed between 2 complex regions. So you've got the foot, which is 26 bones, 33 joints. You've also got the ankle region itself, which is pretty complex in terms of how that needs to function, and how that drives, the ability for the foot to actually function, because it's very hard to get good foot function if you haven't got good ankle function. And then you've got the hip and the pelvic region, and even, I guess, if you want to bring that down, so let's say the whole spine really, how that's very much connected, the spine into the sacrum, pelvis, and how your hip joints basically sit within the pelvis. And if there's a lack of ability there and there's a lack of control, I find that knee pain can often be present as a result. So more symptomatically, I find that that's the case with me, very likely. And it's something that I see a lot. It's something I've seen quite recently, and I think it's not easy because as I said, the knee in reality is kind of like it's a bit of a dumb joint. It is quite restricted. You get a little bit of rotation from I'll try and keep it as simple as possible, from the femur and the tibia. So you got like the I guess the shin bone, and you've got your upper leg, and they sort of rotate a little bit upon one another, and we need that rotation, but the rotation has restrictions, as it should. So you don't, the knee doesn't rotate, or those bones don't rotate that much. The knee basically has no side to side movement, and then it flexes and extends. So, which is the predominant movement that we have, and or the predominant joint action. And so it's so I guess understanding where that pain can come from requires a full movement analysis, and that can often take a little bit of time, because I think, a lot of stuff that I've seen working in a rehab practice here is that people will see knee pain and then focus on the knee pain. Problem with that is, for example, if you're a runner and you've got knee pain, there's probably two main things that are potentially causing that knee pain. One is load. So overloaded, that region gets overloaded. And the second thing is, which is, a question as to why it's loading or overloading, is movement and biomechanical function. So I guess performing a full analysis or understanding how things integrate with one another creates a lot more opportunity to create positive change. So it's not simple, but I think with knees, understanding
what do you commonly see, do you feel,
in terms of like deficits and stuff?
Like do you find that you go to the foot a lot more? Do you find like you go to the hip a lot more? Because I know you were about to say how it's important to understand the relationship between the hip, the knee, the foot. I don't think I'd say I go to both, really, as I do with virtually anyone. I try to, at least. And it might be that, hip internal rotation, so the ability to rotate the leg inwards underneath the pelvis, is pretty restricted. I see that as a reasonable indicator for knee pain personally. Not to say that that's the reason for knee pain, but I'd say it perhaps contributes. And then the question is, why are they not getting that internal rotation? What can we do about that? What do they do during the day? And so on. One thing that I find really important is to video and analyze their gait, because that tends to give me really good indications. I consider gait an active posture, because that gives me really good indications about what their natural unconscious movement strategies are. And that sort of gives, I find that gives us as practitioners a really good opportunity to see where they might be lacking, what strategies they're using, and how we can influence positive change with them. And that really is a full body approach. So it's not really looking at one specific localized region, not just the hip, not just the foot, not just the knee, but trying to, I guess, ask, okay, well, how should everything really integrate in order to allow the knee to function as it should, allow the knee to load as it should, but to not allow the knee to sort of get pulled on or stressed as it shouldn't. That's sort of my strong opinion at the moment on that. How about you, mate? I was going to ask you a little bit about the gait, because you said that's like a big part of your assessment. Yeah. When you're looking at someone's gait, I imagine that it's very easy to kind of like pinpoint a lot of, I guess, deficits, but also movement patterns that it's like, look, if we compare this to an optimal model, that it's probably not going to meet the standards. Just like, people compare a scan to an MRI, and it's like, look, you have all these deviations from what we consider normal. We're now going to kind of like list those. Like, how do you kind of go, all right, I'm going to look at how you move, but how do you personally decide? And I know it's a very, it's a broad question. It's not that specific, but, when someone has like a hip drop, are you looking both bilateral to kind of like see, all right, is that just their normal, or is that something that we actually need to work on? Like, what are you kind of looking for when you are assessing? Are you just like being like, yep, all right, what's the biggest low hanging fruit? And what are like, I guess, the most common things that you find from someone who does assess gait? Because I know that I rarely do it. But yeah.
So that's a really good question, because it's really not easy, because when you've got the active posture, let's say, or the active movement, there's so much happening at once. And so you can look at reference points, and it's something I'm ever, trying to ever develop. It's an ever developing process for me, let's say, as well. But I think the one, or the few things that I find most important to kind of consider is obviously both sides. So if someone gets a hip drop, so when someone takes a step, so I'll try and simplify this so that everyone can envision it. If someone takes a step forward with their left foot, their right foot will still be in contact with the ground, and they'll sort of be moving up onto the toes to propel the body and push the body forward. And as they load that left leg, their pelvis on the right side should drop a little bit and perhaps shift a little bit to the left, you'll find. What we do want to hopefully avoid is an excessive drop of that pelvis, so that the pelvis just kind of collapses over to the left and the whole right side just drops down. That's that pelvic drop that you were talking about. And I think that's one indicator, because that's a question of control. And when that happens, it can also be a really good indicator that they might not be able to load the foot as it should. So when we load and take a step forward, we should, as we start to really bring our body weight forward, what we call center of mass, as we bring that forward onto that front foot, the foot should pronate and flatten. So, big question is that happening at all? If they're shifting out to the side, that means their body weight tends to be shifting off center quite a long way. And if that's happening, it can become quite difficult to also pronate and flatten the foot, particularly the inner half of the foot, because their body weight's actually going in the other direction. So they can be pretty good indicators. Other things are just, and this is where it starts to get a little bit more complicated, is how do the feet land? We should theoretically hit the ground initially with the outer part of our heel. If that's not happening, cool. We can note that it's not happening, but the bigger and more important question is why, and how can we fix that or improve it? And then if we sort of look up the chain, so moving up the body, if someone's not able to rotate and counter rotate their body, so for, if you think about walking naturally, we will get a little bit of an arm swing, and our shoulders tend to rotate with it, which means we get some spinal and rib cage rotation as well. And that's important to actually counter rotate. So if we take a step forward again with our left foot, we'll swing our right arm forward and tend to rotate our upper body a little bit to bring the right side of our upper body forward and rotate to the left towards that hip, just to balance ourselves out. So if we think that we're walking almost like on a tightrope, or like a relatively wide tightrope, that's sort of, I guess, our bandwidth for our balance and control. So when we bring all of these things into play, it can be very, very difficult. One thing that I've started working with, and this is one thing that one of my mentors really introduced to me as, I guess, a tool for assessment, is doing a thing called gait tweaks. So getting a client to film their gait from behind and also from the side, but then also getting them to perform deliberate tweaks. So getting them to walk on a tightrope with one foot in front of the other, maybe turning their feet inwards a little bit, maybe turning their feet outwards, maybe lifting one arm, lifting the other arm, just to see how these movement changes, or what we call constraints. So we're constraining, I guess, the whole task and the situation, the movement itself, how that affects the rest of the body's movement throughout the gait cycle. So that's where I tend to start, and that's really, it can take a little bit more time. And then I think the way I go from there is to just try and break it down into picking and trying to seek out the lowest hanging fruit, as you mentioned, and trying to work with that initially, then reassessing in a couple of weeks. Once we've addressed, a couple of things, okay, how has that affected their gait? We'll get them to refilm it, maybe look at the tweaks again, what happens, and then, then we'll have new information and a new plan.
Yeah, cool. No, I think pain's really interesting, and it's pretty cool that you're talking about the gait tweaks, because I think they might be referring to I think it's the Gray Institute, because I remember doing OBS with a very smart guy and a legend, Luke Reed from Melbourne. I think he's in Point Cook. Can't remember the clinic, so I apologize. But he used to do a lot of that stuff where, toes in, see how that has an impact, kind of like reach up and above. And it was really fascinating, and a very powerful tool, because like, as you said, how does it have an impact up and down the chain when we kind of look at something so fundamental as walking? But look, knee pain's one of those ones where I feel like I've tried a lot of different stuff in the last 18 months. And I've been kind of exposed to a lot of different concepts. And I think it really does depend on who you're working with. I think that kind of like governs things over general principles. And the reason why I say that is because, like, we've both been exposed to, co-contractions, and David kind of popularized like the foam roller bridge, where you kind of getting calf, hamstrings, quads, or like co-contracting to kind of like stabilize that knee. And 9 out of 10 people who try that, no matter what level you are, I guess, on the athletic and movement continuum, are probably going to suck. Yeah. So initially I was like, oh, you must suck, you must need this, which I think there's definitely merit. But the more I started using it, it didn't yield the results that I expected, because I feel like it was very positional, and it also depended on the clientele you work with. Now, most of the clientele that I kind of see, like gym goers and stuff like that. So when it comes to knee pain, and I guess I'm going to talk very specifically probably today, and we can maybe talk about more specific presentations next time. But I also find that the training program and what led to them kind of having knee pain is super important. And I guess, it can go back to as simple as like agonist and antagonist link tension relationships. And it's like, in your training history, how often are you hitting hamstrings compared to quads? And then, like, if you want to go a step further, it's like, all right, well, what about distal hamstrings versus proximal hamstrings? And, you could say the same for like, proximal quad or distal quad. Can the quad lengthen to be able to get into those hamstrings? Do they have that full range of motion at the knee? Can we get that? And this is something that I find is quite common. And I'd be interested to kind of hear whether you see it, is like a lot of tibial external rotation relative to more of an internally rotated femur. And I think that stems from a lot of gym-based athletes, where there's so much normalization of wide stance, turn your feet out, external rotation, got to hit the glutes, all these things. And I think people are pursuing glutes and going after their glutes at the expense of quality movement. And I think that's where a lot of these kind of like functions are like kind of going, especially the foot. Like the foot, like if we just want to kind of come back to the foot, it's like, we know that it needs to make a rigid foot, which is like a supination. So imagine like a high arch, and then you've got like a lower arch, which is like, or a flat foot, which is like that pronation moment. And we know we want to go from both sides. And again, being in the gym environment, what I commonly see is everyone has high arches. They don't have that ability to kind of like get that knee, that tibia to come over the toe, get that foot to kind of flatten down, because a lot of people are, and very good athletes and very high level coaches are cueing, screw your foot, make a rigid foot, knees out. The moment that knee travels towards that outer toe, you're making more of a supinated foot. But how often are people training that knee in line with that big and second toe to really encourage that medial arch to lower? So that's one thing, and I'm kind of going all over the place as ideas kind of come in, but that the foot is one thing I've noticed, and especially in gym people, they seem to struggle a lot with pronation. And I'm starting to wonder whether there's a bit of a stress component with that as well, because I'm someone who naturally has higher arches, but if I spend some time in the beach and relax and chill out and stuff, I notice that my arches are a lot lower. And they kind of like touch the ground. I feel like I can pronate a lot better. So that's something I'm kind of like wanting to kind of like play around with, because I've done a lot of pronation exercises where it's like, you really focus on sensation and that sensory component to really get that information, work on that arch dropping. But I don't know what you've found, but I find it doesn't always stick. I think it's very temporary. Yeah, I feel like you got something to say.
Yeah, so I've got two things I want to go through. So we'll go through that topic first, and then there's something else it's really important to me that I'd like to mention regarding knee pain. So with that, I think it's really important to understand that pronation is a full body process. So the flattening of the foot, the lengthening, so that when the foot flattens, the joints underneath the foot or from that side basically open up and create a little bit more space. The muscles will then be lengthened, and that allows us to, that is the flattening of the foot, allows for absorption so that we can then spring off the ground and shorten those muscles again into what we call supination as we push off the ground. And a really good point that you made is tibial external rotation. So that's when, just in simple terms for those that may not understand this, is that's basically when you've got your foot on the ground. I just want to clarify that this is how you mean it. You've got your foot on the ground and your shin bone is basically almost, it's sort of rotating outwards on the foot, basically relative to your foot and the femur or the upper leg. And so what happens when it rotates outwards and externally rotates is that we're actually sort of moving away from the inner side of the foot, and we need to be able to go from the lateral heel, so the outer part of the heel, and load the foot and flatten the foot and spread the load throughout those joints and throughout the muscle and tissue components of the foot. And so in order to do that, we actually need the tibia to rotate internally, so rotate inwards. And so I think that's where you'll be finding that sort of that relationship between a lot of lifters who are probably screwing the feet out, getting the arches to naturally rise as they will. So for anyone that tries it, if you just try to rotate your feet out, if you just have your feet on the ground, you just try to turn your feet out, or screw the floor, so you want to turn the floor out without moving your feet, your arches will come up. And that creates that outwards rotation of the tibia. But what we actually need in order to get the foot flat, to give us better movement options, is for the tibia to internally rotate. And it's something I've been working with actually quite a lot recently. And again, it's something I had a call with a colleague or mentor of mine about this on Friday. We're discussing exactly that and how to actually potentially get clients to self-mobilize tibial internal rotation in a simple way, because it's really not easy. But I think to understand, going back to my initial point, it's a full body process. So it's really important to understand that in order for the foot to flatten, we need to be able to get the shin bone to rotate inwards. We also need the hip to be able to rotate inwards, and we need some movement at the pelvis as well. And we need to be able to control our body weight forward. And I had a call with a client last Wednesday, and he was pronating. He doesn't pronate, or didn't pronate his feet very well a couple of weeks ago, and we're working on it. I got him to go away and do it, and he got a lot better, but he was just shifting his weight forward and kind of bending his knee and really like putting a lot of, it was almost a bit too aggressive. So we spent a lot
of forcing it.
Yeah. And so we spent a lot of the session on Wednesday, just almost seducing the load throughout his foot. So I was just saying to him, just slowly shift yourself forward. The knee will slowly rotate in, because if the knee will rotate in, we're likely giving ourselves a better opportunity for that tibia to rotate in, I'd say, in comparison to what they're perhaps otherwise doing, or what he's perhaps otherwise doing. And then from there, just slowly spread the load, and just, you don't want to be too tense throughout it, because otherwise you might find that your foot starts to claw. And we got some really good results out of that. And so that's something that's definitely not easy. But again, it comes back to the full body process, and also using the right cues, so everyone understands it differently. So I've started working with the guy from Sean Astorga from he's based in, I think, New York or New Jersey, from AMP Performance Rehab, and he's put together a program for me, and we're working on foot contacts and foot movement. And the way he described it, which I found really good, is just think that your ankle's pulling you forward. Because if you think about that, you can kind of relate to your body being pulled forward from that ankle, and you'll find that, at least I find that I can really control my foot on the ground a lot better. That's a cue for me that might not work for you or the next person. So just understanding that everyone's different. The second thing that's really important to understand is, and what you were saying is about stress, and be it physical, mental stress, emotional, and anything else, how that might affect it. And I think just with knee pain, it's really important to go down that rabbit hole quickly, because the way people perceive their knee pain, particularly those that have had knee pain for a longer period of time, it tends to becomes part of their life. It becomes a moment, or it becomes, I don't know how to, the words missing in my brain at the moment, but I'm sure you know what I mean. It becomes a specific part of their life. So when they start to go up the stairs, they'll feel their knee pain, which means they know the body lives on experiences, which means they know that the knee pain will probably occur. And I think often people get what we call a feed forward mechanism. So they're unconsciously premeditating that's going to happen. And I worked with a guy who, I think we mentioned in a previous podcast, ended up running a marathon. He'd had knee pain for years, ended up running a marathon with like 3 or 4 weeks training, which I would never advise, but he was going to do it anyway. So I just decided to best prep him, and he didn't have knee pain throughout the whole 42 kilometers. 3 weeks before that, he'd just run 6 kilometers and we were buzzing. And a lot of that was I think, and he'd agree, I'm sure, was based around the psychological component of his relationship to his knee. So he'd been really fearful. He was sort of all, consciously or unconsciously expecting the pain to be there, because his experiences for the past 2 or 3 years prior to the marathon were that of knee pain related to exercise of running. So overcoming that is really, really important and not easy. And I think that's something where, people like you and I have done some good work in the recent past, is trying to understand that, and to treat people as emotional, vulnerable beings that have stresses, and that the way that they relate themselves to their pain, if we want to keep it specific with this knee pain topic, that's going to have a specific, or a bandwidth of specificity around that influence on how they go about the pain. How have you found that? I'd be interested to hear.
In what regard?
Just in terms of how, you've also dealt with some knee pain, and I'd love to hear your side about of I guess client relationships to their knee pain, and how you found that perhaps your intervention, or the way that you can build trust and get them to relate to their knee pain, how that has perhaps created a more positive influence.
Yep. I think knee pain is just one of those injuries where it's like, it's so easy. It comes off the tongue. It's like, I've got knee pain, got bad knees,
Which I think is the first problem, which I think is it's a really dangerous game. Sorry to interrupt you there, but I think it's really important to just to mention that can be a really dangerous game, because people, again, they take it on and it becomes part of their life, and they just accept it as part of their life. But I kind of think fuck that. Don't just accept that, because then you'll just be that guy with you'll be the guy in 10 years time with the fucked knee. And I think that's really, really suboptimal.
And I think it's a bit like a back. I feel like a knee and a back, they're just injuries that can be quite debilitating in terms of back pain, I think, from a pain standpoint, but I think from just there's something about knee pain that definitely has an impact on people, definitely from a psychological component. And to answer your question, there has been times where, there's one case in particular that kind of really reinforces this. It's not always biomechanics, or the psychological stuff has altered your biomechanics, whether that's impacting the way you breathe, which then impacts the way your ribcage moves, which then has a flow and effect to the pelvis. You kind of get the idea. And they came in and they had knee pain, and 3 weeks or so, and I was like, hey, sweet, what happened 3 weeks ago? He's like, nah, not much, not related. I'm like, no, what happened? What happened 3 weeks ago? I was like, I guess my missus had a surgery. And I was like, oh, was it a pretty big surgery? And he's like, yeah. And it was that moment where he kind of made that connection where he's like, all right, there was something kind of quite stressful going on. And when we did a lot of work on the diaphragm, releasing that, because what I find is the diaphragm, man, so many people have tight diaphragms. And when you release that, like I've had people that are like military, like in tears, because it gets so jacked up. Sorry?
How do you release it?
So usually what I do is I get like my thumbs and kind of like just, find like the xiphoid process and kind of like go up and towards their chin. And I get them to breathe in and out, and man, it's a sickening pain. And I pretty much do that depending on the client. I'll either do it for reps and sets and maybe not get the full release because it can be quite intense in terms of pain. Otherwise, ideally, I'd wait to do, the reps and sets or reps till that kind of releases. But man, the immediate reaction is like they take a breath and it's just like, whoa. It's like, it's kind of like they learn to breathe for the first time. And when he made that identification, we did the rib cage stuff. We didn't really do anything to do with the knee, and he walked out pain-free. And I guess that's an example where it's not always the biomechanics. And sometimes you just need to chill the body the fuck out. But I also think that with the knees in particular, that it's usually, I think it's usually biomechanics. And I think biomechanics is extremely important with the knees, because the knee's kind of like stuck in the middle of the foot and the hip. And it usually is something that has been like, an ongoing thing where repetition, poor movement patterns over time has led to this imbalance that now has the knee in the middle being like, hey, like, help us out a little bit. And I feel like, again, who I work with, a lot of these common things, I usually go to the hip a lot more than the foot. I feel like if it's a runner or an athlete, I go to the foot a lot faster. Did I say foot? But with these athletes, I find I go to the hip a lot more. And I work on a lot of what, Pat Davidson kind of brought the term to me, was like, sagittal competency. And that's like, all right, let's work on the plane of motion of front back first. Let's probably bring these lifters into more of a shoulder width stance, and maybe even a unilateral stance, because they're so used to, these wider stances, these external rotated stances, and they're not able to utilize fundamental movement patterns, whether that's, a squat or a hinge. And I find that, learning to really teach someone to be able to kind of like hinge correctly, load that hip, like load it to explode, is kind of like, a saying I quite like, because a lot of people don't know how to get into their hip, to be able to get into their hip and utilize it to come forward. And what you'll find is a lot of people, they love to use their quads.
So
what's the fastest? Yeah.
Just quickly, just before you go on, just want to clarify a couple of things to really simplify. So you mean front back as in, can they just move forward and back without having to rotate or move side to side?
Yeah. Okay. Like build competency in that plane of motion instead of going side to side or going rotation. It's like, look, there's times where you can skip steps and maybe go frontal plane or transverse. But what I've found is with the people that I work with and the type of training they do, that working on these simple, sagittal competency, because like a lot of the time, I hate to say it, but like they suck at those movement patterns. And it's like, if you suck in that plane of motion, I don't really want to take you side to side and, really focus on hip hikes or hip drops or, adduction and abduction and kind of, really working on that pelvis, moving on a femur or femur on a pelvis. I feel like if they can strip things back to like a basic, like, can they squat? Can they hinge? A lot of the time it's not. And they have a lot of difficulty there. So did you have like a question that you wanted to kind of like?
Yeah. So just wanted to ask you one more thing. Can you specify or give us a good example, please, of getting into the hip? So what do you actually mean by that? And perhaps also a simple scenario or example of how you might improve that?
Yep. I think when I say get into a hip, it's like, well, the first thing is, do they have a full range of motion? Because if they don't have a full range of motion, that's going to limit your ability to kind of utilize a muscle from a lengthened to a mid to a shortened range of motion. So let's just look at internal rotation. So for internal rotation to occur, we need, and I guess the best way to kind of like think about it is, if you were kind of like sitting at your desk and you took your right leg and placed it over your left leg, you're going to feel like a bit of a glute stretch. Now, if someone can't get length in that posterior hip capsule or can't get those tissues to lengthen, well, then they're never going to be able to get fully into internal rotation, if that makes sense. So like the first thing, and that, like when you think about how all these tools work, it's like glute stretches work because it's going to open up that hip capsule. And they're going to be like, oh, I feel so good. But you don't have that reinforcement of, I guess, a better, in my opinion, interventions to kind of like update that hardware to be like, all right, sweet. You need to be able to lengthen that tissue and have it stay instead of going back to, after however long, back to, its default mechanism. So that's what I kind of mean by like a hip or like, a hinge. Can they kind of like hinge back and move in this horizontal movement? Because what you'll find, and let's just use like just a basic hinge movement, people move in a vertical plane of motion. They always care because they have this idea that they have to get, just past the knees or to the knees. That's kind of like the finish line. And they always focus on that. And when they focus on that, they move in more of a vertical plane of motion, which means that they usually, have a little bit of lumbar flexion a lot of the time. And they don't know how to move into that hip by moving in a horizontal plane. And that's why, like, one of the biggest cues, no matter who you are, what level they are, or how much load you're lifting, is I love a good, stand 20 centimeters in front of a wall and cue hip back. And I don't care about anything else. Yeah, because it's like you have to move in a horizontal movement pattern. You have to self-organize. You have to figure it out for yourself to be able to get backwards, if that makes sense. And like a lot of the time, people can't get back there because they want to go down and use that vertical plane of motion. And then from there, I'll either, I love a good single leg variation or, a bilateral. It's like, all right, let's do the exercise just in front of the wall. Because like load is so important, especially for like a lot of these people I work with, is like they don't want to do body weight. It's like, man, it's like I lift all this weight. I'm not doing a body weight. Like, how's that going to help? And it's like, yeah, I get it. So let's do that exercise with load because that's going to make you happy. But let's use this, I think you like the word using as a constraint. Mm-hmm. I just in my head, it's like, how can I make this person do it without having to think too much? Yeah. So that's, I guess, that is a constraint. And like what you'll find is that people can get into their glute a lot more. Then they can utilize their foot pressure to be able to, have that chain reaction upwards to be able to bring their hips forward. And what a lot of the time I find is people's center of mass is so far forward anyway, especially like, people, and I know we're going on tangents here, like people that, use their calves all the time. It's like if you just stand up, stand shoulder width apart and have you just rock your body weight forwards, feel your calves like rip, like they're preventing you falling forwards. So a lot of people actually struggle going backwards to get into their hip to then bring them forwards. So that's one of the things that I notice is people don't know how to utilize their glutes in a shoulder width stance or a single leg that doesn't involve knees out or a booty band or some form of sensory component to be like, yeah, I've got my glutes working. So that's one of the biggest things that I find, and it's so simple, is just being able to get people to get into their hip to utilize their glutes. Because like, I think what's happened in this last year or last 2 years is people are like kind of shat on glutes and they're like, all right, you got to get into hip shifts and adductors and stuff like that. And I went with that team or that tribe or bandwagon. But what I think is the issue with glutes is like people were applying the exercises incorrectly or utilizing the wrong glute exercises, which then led for people to shit on them because all the exercises that they talked about with adductors where again, we're in that shoulder width, kind of like, not these massive wide stances that people do all the time, which I think like, is it anything special? No, I think the magic comes from the fact that's like, you're giving them what they haven't done for ages and you're bringing it back to more fundamental movements, which is like, shoulder width apart, like that, from a gait stance, gait's not my, my expertise, but you're not walking like, side to side outside that shoulder width stance, like everything's kind of like kept within. So yeah, that's one thing that I noticed with a lot of knees.
And you found, yeah, so that's being able to get control of the hips and being able to shift sort of the body weight back. So I guess for people to be able to envision that if you just stand 20, 30 centimeters away from a wall and you just let your hands slide down the front of your leg and just try to touch so keep your whole the foot or both of your feet completely on the ground and just shift your butt towards the wall and try and touch the wall.
Yeah, that's it.
You find that just having that extra movement option to be able to use your hips just really supports that knee pain.
Yeah, and I think Well, it helps a massive thing. Like I had a girl that with back pain, and she's got the mobility to get there, and it's like she was going based off what she sees on the gram, which is to go X distance or two, will they have a sensation, but it was at the price of loaded spinal flexion. In her case, she had a bit of disc irritation. It wasn't too happy. Did this movement. It's like, oh, now she goes to what this this range of motion that she can actually control. And it's like, oh, now she can hinge without back pain. It's like, it's something that I think a lot of people underrate is the basics. And when it comes to knee pain, I think being able to utilize your glutes, because at the end of the day, you look at the size of I was going to go fuckers, but then I was like, I shouldn't say that. And I've used the word anyway. But I was like, you look at the size of them, they're big things. And it's like, they have a lot of control over your center of mass, over the femur, which is then going to position the knee. And I think that a lot of people need to hit the glutes. And that's where I think Andrew Locke, he's brought in a lot of glute stuff. And, I love him. He's a mentor. He's, doing so many good things for the industry. But I think there's just too much emphasis on the glute stuff without considering more of a narrower stance. But when you look at kind of like the demands of who he works with, it's a lot of powerlifters that have those wider stances. And I think you could argue both ways the importance of doing that, but then also coming back to more of an athletic stance. But what I was going to get at was the other thing as well was the length tension relationships. And I think for those that are in the gym, I think those that focus on building their legs, so much of it is quads. And it's like, you don't really see someone with good hamstrings these days. And I remember having a client when I was at uni, and I was a PT, and, I was at uni, so they didn't listen to the osteo side of things. So they went to Kaiser, and he had patella tendon pain. And a good thing at Kaiser is they test like your strength in each muscle. And man, like his quads compared to his hamstrings, it was like embarrassing. I think we had a laugh for a good 5 minutes about it. But, some simple strengthening of the hamstrings to bring that, the strength ratios, if you want to go with that, was enough to get rid of that tendon pain. And it's like, he didn't even do any like traditional isometrics or tendon loading or bringing up that low tolerance. It was just a mere antagonist, agonist. What's kind of like going on with the length tension relationship that's then compromising the joint. So when he does an exercise and loads at structures, the tendon was taking too much load. So I think looking at distal hamstrings and also like proximal upper hamstrings and glutes, I think can get you a long way when it comes to knee pain. And then I think like where people don't go is kind of like, as you were saying, it's like, what's the pelvis doing? Can the pelvis rotate away from that front leg to allow it to pronate? Does the foot have the mobility to be able to pronate? And all that stuff, I think is really what determines the difference between getting someone quite a long way and kind of really like kind of bringing it all together. So I think I'm just waffled. So
yeah, I think it's interesting because I agree with a lot of what you said, but I also have a different approach, which I think is good as the host of this podcast, that we also do have sort of different, I wouldn't say belief systems, I'd say we're very aligned in that sense, but I think to summarize that, like I think sort of less about localized musculature, and I think more about actual joints within functional movement. But it's interesting to get that approach, because I think we'll continue to learn from each other as we even just do these episodes. And I think obviously the muscles like the glutes and stuff obviously play a massive role. I consider it more in terms of the coordination and communication among the muscles. So not at all disagreeing with what you're saying, but I just envision it slightly differently. So a good example is you have a football team, and each player is a muscle within the team, and you start your preseason, and every muscle or player is doing sort of their own thing. They've kind of got a similar vision to get functional movement or to win the football game. But it's almost like the tactics of the coordination. So how can we get the team to work better together and communicate and bring things rather than from being, isolated muscles or isolated players to having one team? And that's sort of how I look at movement and muscle loading and joint function is how can you get the glutes and the hamstrings and the calves and the quads and the adductors to communicate with one another, and that's that they're co-contractions and what we call intermuscular coordination. So coordination and the interplay between muscles. How can we get that to create better loading and better functional movement? So I think it's very similar to what you've been saying. I think it's just interesting to see how we process things really differently, which I think is great.
Yeah, I think a lot of the reasons why we probably have such differing, I guess, approaches or things that like govern what we would do is maybe the clientele. Because I think like a lot of the people that you work with, a lot of runners, a lot of dynamic, a lot of change of direction, 3-dimensional based sports. And I think that's where, it's about how well do things communicate compared to, I guess, a lot of gym-based people where that's kind of like their sport. And, when you look at the, I guess, meat and potatoes of their training and what they want to do, it is a lot of isolating. So it's like, like a lot of these things have been isolating. So you kind of have to isolate to begin with and then maybe integrate it. And I think that's, you made a good point. And like, I think I really like that footy analogy is like, all right, if you're going to isolate the muscle, like let's go like distal hamstrings, whether you're doing a leg curl or the leg curl, it's like, all right, sweet. But like, how can we then take that movement and bring it into something where we kind of bring it all together? And I think that's where it's like the communication side of things. And while I don't think everyone needs to barbell back squat, definitely not. I think that's where, good thing about squats is you're working on a movement pattern where things have to coordinate. Things have to like be brought together. And that's the big, one of the biggest differences between like a leg press and a squat is that the leg press, you don't really have to have that communication. And that's why a lot of people in the, strength and conditioning world like to say that squats are functional, an athlete must back squat because you've got a lot of that communication. You have to brace your core from an internal standpoint, not an external where, you've got the external stability of the machine. So yeah, I think that's a big point that I think a lot of people don't realize is like, all right, you isolate, but you got to integrate. And I would even argue that you have to do those things in the same session or in the same exercise prescription, instead of being like, we're going to isolate and then we're going to integrate in a week or 2 weeks or whatever the game plan is. I think it's like, no, you isolate so that you can go straight into an integration exercise and actually bring that communication together, because that's what's going to make it stick. And that's what's going to make the brain feel safe.
Yeah, absolutely. We wanted to discuss elbows as well. And I'd love to get your thoughts on what you've recently been dealing with in terms of elbow injuries or elbow pain. And the way I see it, the elbow joint is actually quite similar in a lot of ways to the knee joint. It sits between two relatively complex regions, being the hand and the shoulder, albeit that the hand tends to have less contact to things in comparison to our foot, where we tend to stand and walk on our feet, rather, for those that do like to walk on their hands or walk like a four-legged animal, go for it. But that's something different. And yeah, I'd love to get your opinion on how you see the elbow joint in comparison to the knee joint. So just what we've been speaking about for the last 45 minutes or so, and also what you've been dealing with and how you've created successful outcomes based on your clientele and the presentations that have been standing or sitting before you.
I only laugh because it's like, I hate elbows. I have a love-hate relationship with them. I think there's something a lot easier about knees than there is elbows. And the presentations that seem to be coming through are mostly online. I've got quite a few in person, but most of the elbows are online. So it's a simple joint, but there's a lot going on in a very small space. But I think instead of maybe talking about very specifics, although I'm happy to do that, I think some of the things that I've definitely learned lately is elbows are very similar to knees in terms of, and I've always thought that they're stuck in the hand and the shoulder, and people kind of have quite a good understanding that makes sense. Let's just say that. And one thing that I've found lately is it's kind of like, how much does the hand have a role on elbows? And I'm starting to think that they have a massive role, because I've been playing around a bit with a few things myself now to kind of give people a bit of an insight. If you know what an easy bar is in the gym, my pronation abilities and supination abilities were pretty much as if I was holding an easy bar. And it's like that bar where like your grip's like this, it's not fully supinated, it's not fully pronated, it's kind of like in between. Semi-pronated, semi-supinated is kind of like.
So you're saying your ability to rotate your hands. So if people think just having their arms in front of them, your ability to rotate your hands. So you should be able to turn your palms upwards towards the sky and rotate them back the other way. And you could only sort of go up.
At 90 degrees. And like now it's like, I'm pretty much there. I've still got a bit of elbow, so a bit of compensation, but it's like, they're a lot better. And what I've found is that my wrists and my hands, they couldn't move. It was like a foot. And one of the screens that I like to do with people to kind of screen their hand is a push-up. Mm-hmm. And what you'll find is that when people do a push-up, they load the outside of their hand, and on the way up, they don't ever load the inside two fingers. And I think that's a great way to kind of like see what's going on at the hand, because a lot of people, we assess these things in an open chain. And it's like, all right, well, what happens when we load that hand? And like a lot of people, it's same stuff. They just can't get that pronation or that dump into the first two fingers. They can't get those bones to move. So I was playing around with a lot of hand stuff, because I'm like, look, the hand is the distal part of the elbow. A lot of people go after what's going on at the elbow with the extensors, the flexors, rotation, brachialis, bicep, triceps. There's a lot of stuff that people do, but I'm like, no one's talking about the hand. There's a few people out there, but it's like, I started playing around and like, man, I was getting some movement. And at the start, my wrist was like, oh, what is going on here? And I kept pushing. And I was kind of doing similar stuff that I do to the foot. And what I found was my bones started moving heaps. And then I rechecked my pronation. I'm like, whoa, what? Hold up. What's kind of going on here? Because it's like that pronation saying that we're talking about lifts and knees. It's like, no, I've just got bad pronation. That's how it is. And that was my story. And I was like, wow, there's something that I'm missing here. And it's kind of making sense, because when you think about a lot of gym stuff, man, it's a lot of contraction. It's a lot of holding onto the bar. It's a lot of fixed wrist. A lot of people that don't have good wrist position kind of go into this extended position.
Why, if you think it was because of that? Yeah.
And I think it's just constantly, it's like, you haven't trained those bones to move. And like, you can even see in my hand, it forms a certain position because of, years and years of gripping a bar in a certain way, in a certain position. A lot of stuff, good programming will rotate grips, but it's still gripping. And how often do we move through the hand? How often do you get like someone to, really get through and get those bones moving? I don't know about you, but hardly ever, unless you came in with like a wrist or a hand stuff specifically, people don't really look there. So that's one of the biggest things that I found with elbows lately. I've also found that, direct arm work is something that a lot of people in the gym neglect. And I feel that direct arm work is crucial for elbows, and it's crucial for shoulders, especially from a shoulder stability component, because everyone looks at, in my opinion, this is not to diss on anyone else, but it's like, if you know a thing or two, you'll look at the rib cage, you'll then look at the shoulder blade, and then you'll look at the arm bone. And then if you have time and you think it's relevant, you'll look from like the hand to the shoulder. So you're considering all variables. And people know that, the rotator cuff's role is kind of in stability of the shoulder. And the main movers are kind of like the deltoid and, the chest, the lats, that type of thing. But I don't think a lot of people talk about, and I know Jordan Shallow's done this, and extremely smart guy, is the role of the arms, like, the long head of the tricep and the long head of the bicep, how they connect to the shoulder, or the short head connects to the coracoid process. But those things are very important for shoulder health. And it's like the shoulder, just like the wrist, is made for a lot of movement. If that's restricted, well, then that's going to have an impact on the elbow. So that's another thing that, like, I think when it comes to elbows is very important. It's kind of like with the knee. What's going on at the hip? And it's like, what's going on at the shoulder? And then again, it's like, the foot, can it move? Because if the foot can't move, that's going to impact, the tibia coming over the knee or the foot. And just like, if the hand can't move, that's going to impact the ability of pronation and supination to occur, which is then going to impact the elbow. Again,
which
I
is
feel
not
like
too
I've just
similar, which is not too dissimilar to the knee scenario that we spent quite a while talking about. Is what's around, what's in the same environment, or the same region, let's say, and how could that be affecting it? And if you look at the shoulder and the rib cage function, if we're not able to get the necessary mobility, what we call proximally, so centrally, around the rib cage and shoulder, in my opinion, it would be naive to think that that's not going to affect us down the chain, so somewhere else. So in that elbow, perhaps affecting the ability for the biceps and triceps to function, which is, perhaps likely going to affect the optimal joint function abilities, or capabilities, of the elbow, and then perhaps even into the hand. Moving to your point about the pressures, the hand pressures, it's really interesting because I was playing with exactly the same thing. And when you do a push-up, and when you come out of the push-up, so you're pushing your chest away from the floor, and you consciously start to use the inner, let's say the inner half, or the, around that thumb, below the thumb region of the hand, I find that I'm actually able to get noticeably better movement out of my shoulders too. So when I press, I find that I can actually press, and I can actually reach a little bit further away from the floor with my shoulders, due to the fact that I'm pressing, with the inner part of my hand. And if you look at that, so just by doing that, the elbow's in between the hand and the shoulder, the pressure that I'm putting through the hand during a push-up, just as one simple example, I find subjectively has improved my ability to use my shoulder. And so if that's positively influencing my shoulder, and the elbows in between, I think it's, reasonable to think that we're probably doing good things. Not all the time, but I think that's a pretty reasonable point to start. And I think you'll find that, you've sounds like you've done a lot more work into that than I have in recent times. I'd just love to hear you go a little bit deeper into that, and perhaps what else you've been doing.
So I think what led me down that route of kind of that hand is a lot of failing. And, I know a lot of people don't like to talk about their losses, but
love it.
Certain regions can present a lot of difficulties. And you kind of start asking yourself, when you get a little bit of success, all right, and then you get a little bit more success, and it's like, all right, and then you have saying it has heaps of success, and you're like, all right, why did that have such a big impact? And you sometimes find that the things that you got a little bit right, that exercise or that intervention that you gave actually has a combination of all of those. And again, it's that communication side of things that really the brain was like, sweet, I understand this, cool, I feel safe, whatever you want to say. And it gives you a certain range of motion or a decrease in pain and that type of thing. So the hand is definitely something that I've started implementing, is really working on kind of getting the hand to move. But when it comes to the elbow itself, depending on the presentation, I like to give certain arm work for certain presentations. And, a lot of this comes down to your assessment findings and what they've done a lot in training. But there's common themes that I've found, and that's a lot of people, especially those in the gym, especially guys in particular who love training arms, have really jacked up elbows when they've done so much tricep extensions. And, I've been there, I've done that where I did tricep extensions, full rack type of stuff. And it's like, to lift heavy loads, you need to put a lot of intent. And it's like, you're literally putting intent and slamming elbow extension. And it's like, that's something that's going to get a little bit angry, whether it's the tendons, because it's like, holy shit, we got to kind of distribute this force or absorb this force, or whether it's the joint itself. And that comes down to, one, I think skill execution. I think a lot of people neglect tempo, and it's like tempo is a great thing to teach control, but it also slows things down. And from a tendon standpoint, a lot of people, you can increase weight a lot faster because your muscles adapt quick, but the tendons don't. And a lot of people that kind of like go 0 to hero or go through a very intense phase and maybe haven't prepped correctly, they get a lot of tendon issues in my experience. And I think generically, a lot of tricep extension stuff, like you go through with soft tissue and it nearly makes people cry. So, doing a lot more bicep work usually offsets a lot of these things. And again, it goes back to link tension relationships and programming and like grips. That's what I found is super effective. And then you kind of look, I don't know if it's a big thing, but I've been talking about shoulder extension for a while now, and I think it's crucial. I think no one trains it. The only movements people kind of really go into are dips, or they kind of go into like a bench where they're in shoulder extension, but they got put into there because of load. They didn't overcome load to get into that position. And what I find is people don't train shoulder extension, so they have poor rear delts. They also have poor long head of the tricep. Well, rear delts are the primary external rotators of the shoulder. Long head of the tricep connects to the shoulder blade. So now we're compromising shoulder stability. We're also not potentially able to take the anterior shoulder into length. What a lot of people have, it's like they have a lot of anterior shoulder pain. And like, it kind of builds, and people could say, oh, well, the infraspinatus trigger point is the front of the shoulder. It's like, all right, sweet. But the infraspinatus, so I'm just getting worked up. I kind of love this stuff. It's like, that's an external rotator. What's the prime mover that's an external rotator of shoulder? The rear delt. And it's like, how do you hit that as well? It's like shoulder extension. So I'm seeing a lot of these kind of imbalances with the people I deal with as a result of poor programming or poor manipulation of exercises and having discrepancies in length tension relationships.
I find as well, just getting shoulder extensions, I just get people often to, something I've been playing with the last few months is just getting people to hold on to like a bar behind them, a bar or barbell or something, and just getting them to take it. So if I hold, if I have my left arm behind me, palm towards the ground, and I'm holding a bar behind me, and I just take a step forward with my left foot and back. And just, so what it does is it pulls my arm further back relative to my body, or it shifts my body forward and the arm stays. So what I'm doing is I'm getting more length through the front muscles of the shoulder, even, and I'm actually getting hopefully a greater range of motion throughout that, because when I take the step forward, my arm tends to come a little bit higher due to that step forward and me shifting my whole body minus the arm forward. And then doing that and playing with hand positions. So I have the palm down, then I might do the hand rolled in and the palm up. And then one that's pretty intense is even just rotating the hand outwards and then having the palm up. And I find that just giving people a variety and actually getting them to move the other way is something that's often very foreign. And if you think about this from a very simple, like society-based habitual terms or things, for want of a better description, everything we do these days is with a bit of shoulder flexion and kind of the shoulders inwardly rotated here. Right. So we're on our laptops, we're doing this, we're doing that. Everything's in front of us and nothing's behind us. Yet what we need is ability. We need ability in all directions. And
variability.
And variability. Yeah. And I think it's quite ironic how simple that is as a tool. And I'm not saying that this is going to fix elbow pain all the time and stuff like that. And it's something I've just been playing around with different clients and different individuals, but it seems to yield pretty good results, at least short term. But from a logic perspective, it is very logical. You're getting them to do something where they're probably restricted and that they don't do very often. And you do it in a way that's not too intense so that the body goes, oh, I quite like this. So, quick wins.
Yeah. And I think, as you said, long hanging fruit, give them what they don't have. And I think when you take away the ego and, obviously some things are very complex and humans are very complex, I think changes shouldn't be that hard. Like, you should be able to look at someone's life or look at their program or look what they've done and what they haven't done and give them what they haven't done. And it usually has a, big outcome. And if you just make it as simple as this, if you're negative and you have negative words going through your head and that makes you feel like shit, you start putting some positive input, it's going to change the output and you have a massive difference. So if you take the concept of the body and what seems to work, why do we have to get so fancy and overcomplicate things when it comes to human movement? It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense at all. And I think that's what I'm finding is like, I'm going back to the basics. I think I've done the roundhouse of kind of going down complex stuff, appreciating stuff, seeing how it comes together. And now it's like, I just want to keep it basic. I just want to keep it basic and stop going based off models and this and that and following what the systems say and just going, back to the basics of like, what has this person done and paying more attention to the case history and what's got them in front of you. I think that is where the details are.
For sure. Giving something back that they've lost.
Yeah.
No, I love it, mate. Let's wrap it up there. That was really productive and hopefully pretty damn insightful for quite a lot of people. It's just a nice what's the word? Like a nice way to sort of express how we go about things, what our beliefs are, and also some limitations and understanding that things are really fucking complex, but that's also totally fine. And on that, if anyone wants to contact us via Instagram or other and just even disagree, I'd love to discuss that and perhaps, bring that the disagreement or conversation up in the next podcast. I think it'd be awesome to turn this into a real open, egoless communication platform. And, we'll learn from that. Hopefully a lot of other people learning from it as well. And I think we can all benefit from that because at the end of the day, what we want to do is help people to live better. So I think we'll leave it there and we'll be back next week. Onwards and upwards.
Sweet.
Have a great night, mate.
You too, man.
The Between Two Lines podcast, talking about performance, life, and everything in between. Featuring your hosts, Johnny Stahl and Ash Hamilton.